Yeah, sorry, my internet dropped out for a bit. So, hi everyone, welcome to another session of the Startup Grind virtual fireside chat series. We just wrapped up the Pakistan Tech Summit last month, which hosted some 260 speakers, 120 sessions, and again, thanks a lot for the amazing audience who tuned in and all the speakers from across the world who joined. This session is very special for us because we did a session earlier focusing on Canada, Pakistan, technology trade, and how to kind of explore collaborations. But this session is, I think, more specific to these collaborations when it comes to startups, right? With this, I'd like to introduce the fantastic speaker we have today because she's also an amazing community builder, which I also am, and I feel proud to be a community builder. So Victoria is the co-founder of Startup Canada, a non-profit organization. She also now runs the Innovation and Entrepreneurs Foundation as the president. She is currently doing her PhD from the University of Oxford. She has a long history of being a social entrepreneur. She's an executive leader with a track record of building, designing, operating amazing ecosystems, clusters, networks, and organizations. Uh, One of the amazing things about her work is that she has actually propelled Canada onto the global stage as an innovation nation, right? As one of Canada's leading proponents of entrepreneurship and innovation with deep relationships and ties across academia, across industry, government, and media. She is a diplomat with the ability to lead, communicate, and forge consensus in any environment. So we'll explore more about her background and all the fantastic initiatives that she's done and how can one person do so much things in one lifetime as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Victoria.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
It's an honor to connect. So I've always been, I've always loved Canada for the fact that a lot of my friends live there. But also I think Canadians are very welcoming people, as experienced by all my travels as well. Over the years, we've done a lot of programs in the US, specifically Silicon Valley. So this year was our third year with our delegation to Silicon Valley. We took like 50 people in total. We've taken some 150 startups and digital leaders so far to Silicon Valley, but we hope to be in Canada next year. This year got cancelled because of COVID, but hopefully next year we'll come there and physically also explore all the opportunities for collaborations, right? But with this, I'd like to kind of give the audience an understanding of your background. So you run all these different organizations. You're also completing your PhD, which is amazing. So how did you start, and what's kind of your background, and then how did you end up building Startup Canada and then doing all of this stuff?
Cool. Well, thanks so much for having me. Like I said, so my background is actually political science and governance and public policy. And right from when I was very little, I thought that to make a difference in the world, you had to go into government, you had to go into politics and to create policies. And so that was my career trajectory. I worked for nonprofits. I worked for the United Nations Association of Canada, for Amnesty International, just trying to find my place. I ended up doing my master's at the University of Oxford in global governance and diplomacy, but there I found my people. I joined Oxford Entrepreneurs, which was a student club full of these enterprising students from all different disciplines, and I just totally found my place in the world. And so while my background is political science, governance, and public policy, my passion is entrepreneurship. And what I love most about entrepreneurship is that you can manifest anything into the world and take what's unique about yourself and make an impact for your family, your community, your country, and humanity. And so I just fell in love with it. So I started a nonprofit in the UK called NACU, the National Association of College and University Entrepreneurs, during the last recession in 2008. And so that continues today to support 35,000 young people every single year through student clubs. So now we have student clubs across every college and university in the United Kingdom. I was then repatriated back to Canada through a unique program called the Recruitment of Policy Leaders Program to come back to Canada and work on small business policy. And so I joined the Government of Canada in 2011. During that time, I really understood that, wow, although we're a very large geographical country and we have a very small population in Canada, we have 36 million Canadians, we really weren't connected. We weren't creating an ecosystem that could really scale up important companies that could become anchors in our economy for the future. And so I left the government to start Startup Canada, which today has become Canada's entrepreneurship organization. And Startup Canada has chapters across Canada called startup communities, many of which run startup grinds and accelerators and are fully connected into the ecosystem with a big focus on inclusivity, engaging women, Indigenous entrepreneurs, our newcomer communities, and really kind of bringing everyone into the fold so that you're tripping over innovation and entrepreneurship everywhere. So after growing Startup Canada for the last 7 years, we essentially acquired a foundation called the Manning Innovation Awards, which recognized excellence in innovation in Canada for the last 30 years. So we absorbed that into a charity that's now called Innovators and Entrepreneurs Foundation. But over the last 18 months, I've been working very hard on succession so that I could then move my career forward. And we now have a new executive director at Startup Canada. And succession is a key part of community building that we often don't talk about. It's really hard to do. And the earlier you start, the better. And I decided to pivot and go back to school to do my doctorate in AI governance and ethics at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. So I'm currently doing that from Canada because of COVID. And during this time, I started an AI company called 19AI that's using AI technologies to keep everyone safe and continuing to advise on that company while I continue to be a community builder, support Startup Canada from the sidelines, and work on my doctorate. So that's a little bit about me and kind of my background. But I think because of the policy background, I'm one of the top lobbyists in Canada for innovation and entrepreneurship. I represent Canada on a global stage at state visits, global summits, diplomatic tours, helping to forge connections between our ecosystems. So I'm super excited to be here today.
Oh, that's such an amazing background and journey, and it's fantastic to see how many things you have created, and even in this time you're doing multiple things at the same time. I think that's just fantastic, right? So I'll there's a lot of stuff that goes into community building. You started this non-profit, and I think the Canadian program that brought you back, that is a fantastic program, right? Because for a country like Pakistan, which has uh, a very successful diaspora in Silicon Valley, even in Canada and all the places, maybe we could explore a program like this where we even bring our diaspora back to help us with many of these issues. I think it's important to mention that the CTO of Seattle and the former CIO of Ottawa happens to be a Pakistani Canadian, right? And I think it is people like him. He's also going live for a session with us in like 3 hours. So I think it's important to kind of engage all the amazing leaders as well, right? So with this, I'll come to my next question. So for our audience who I've done a lot of research on the Canadian startup ecosystem. I understand there are a number of opportunities like the startup visa, there's the talent something program, and there are a lot of other opportunities. But maybe if you can give some overview of the Canadian startup ecosystem and how it has developed over the years, and what is it, offering to the world?
Certainly. Well, it's totally transformed in the last 10 years with Startup Canada, really innovative government policies, including the startup visa, as well as a really concerted investment in key sectors that we're betting on the future. So the Canadian landscape, so we're a very large country. We're right above, of course, the United States. And 95% of Canadians live on the 49th parallel. So that's actually the Canada-US border. So most of us live very close to the United States. It's pretty cold here. So we're kind of down south in Canada. So much of Canada is not populated. It's, natural resources, it's forests, it's nature. It's such a beautiful country. So it's very clustered. We have 5 major cities, and each major city definitely has a tech community and a tech cluster that are all connected now across the country. Our biggest hubs for startups and scale-ups are definitely Toronto and Montreal, Vancouver, and Ottawa. But there's Halifax on the East Coast that's doing a lot with ocean technologies and cybersecurity. And then, of course, Calgary in the middle. So, when you're thinking of the Canadian ecosystem, it's very diverse. But what I can say is no matter where you plug in, we are working so well together that every door is the right door. And because we're such a small population, we all know each other. So all the community builders, we know each other. We call each other up. We have Slack channels where we're communicating. So I think that's really important. One of the big shifts that Canada made was really opening ourselves to the world. We obviously recognize the importance of not being totally reliant on the United States. And so we've negotiated new trade agreements with Europe, with Chile, with Latin America. And we're looking to open up new trade agreements across the world to really diversify our economy, our exports, our imports, our collaborations around acquisitions, investing in companies globally, all of these types of things. So a concerted trade agenda, and part of that includes the creation of Canadian trade accelerators across the world. So we piloted those in New York and Boston and Silicon Valley. And now we have a whole network of 20 trade accelerators that over the next 5 years will take place all over the world. And I'll check out if there's one coming to Pakistan, but I know that there's already a few in India. So I think we can make a good case for, Islamabad. So in addition to all of kind of that government-led activity, there's a vibrant startup community. There's founder institutes, startup grinds, startup weekends. There's funds popping up for particular sectors across the country. It's really never been a better time, especially when you juxtapose kind of our social and economic policy with our friends down south at the moment. Right now, Canada is really the Silicon Valley of the North. And so that's something that we're really proud of. The key sectors that Canada is investing in the most are definitely med tech, so health technologies, anything AI. We have endless opportunities. We have a whole AI supercluster. Anything digital technologies, we have a digital technology supercluster, cybersecurity, ocean technology. We have the largest coastal region in the entire world. So we really want to steward our oceans and really invest in technologies to protect wildlife, as well as to, really build up the ocean economy globally. So those are some of the sectors that matter to us, but you can lump in fintech and everything like that over into our digital work. What I will also say is, even though there's very, very big clusters with accelerators and incubators and research parks and funds, and while we have those in our major cities, we have over 100 cities, towns, and villages in Canada that are connected as spokes into those hubs. So no matter where you might come to Canada, you're always connected with the tech community and the investment community, and you just have to plug in. So it's a nice combination of grassroots entrepreneurial culture, a give back culture. When you succeed, you invest in the next generation, and then also that government support that's so important in kind of getting new ideas off the ground.
So that's fantastic. I think all these different ecosystem builders coming together in this vibrant country with so many opportunities, I would say, right? Because I've heard of a lot of Pakistanis who maybe moved to the US for education and some other thing, maybe family, and then ended up starting a company. So we have way more success stories from the US as compared to Canada, right? But we also have a very vibrant in diaspora in Toronto, which I'm personally connected with, but I'm sure there are more people in Ottawa as well.
Oh yeah.
And again, obviously, like companies like Shopify and Canada's focus on AI technologies, right? I think that really sets it apart as one of a kind ecosystem, and especially in the current environment, we think that a lot of doors are open in Canada for Pakistani startups. So we had Hasib Awan, who is Pakistani, Canadian, and American as well. But he started BitAccess in Toronto, which was the first ever Bitcoin ATM in the world. Then that became a success. So recently, a year ago, Hasib came to Pakistan. We hosted this session on the Canada Startup Visa, right? Because he wanted to kind of raise awareness on this program. And to our surprise, two of the startups since then
Yeah.
have applied and gotten
Awesome.
to the program, right? And we're trying to get even more startups connected with all these different incubators and investors in Canada, because I think this is a fantastic opportunity, especially for companies who have a global consumer base. It doesn't matter where you're based. So maybe a more developed ecosystem. We understand there are a lot of challenges with funding and other issues in Pakistan, but still the tech talent is amazing. So the tech talent can stay here, but the founders can operate out of Toronto or Ottawa or maybe some other ecosystem, like they've been going to Silicon Valley and other places, right? So with this, I'd love for the audience to hear from you about some of these programs that might be open for Pakistani startups or international startups per se to expand into the Canadian market or to the global market, but operate out of Canada.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Well, there's two key ones that I would definitely highlight, and most of you probably already know about the Startup Visa program. But basically, it's an opportunity for you to actually relocate to Canada and to start up your company and anchor in an ecosystem. And we've seen tremendous success from that. The reason that it's so successful is that your visa is actually attached to an accelerator in Canada. So it's
Yeah,
kind of like matching, and that accelerator has access to all of the local investors and resources. And so you kind of come over and you have kind of a family around you that really is there to support your company's success. And we're betting on you through that program. I think that's really important. And what I love about that program is that it's really about the entrepreneur. And so sometimes, as entrepreneurs, we pivot as we go. Sometimes things don't work out, but it's really betting on you as an entrepreneur. And so I can definitely share the link to that so you can learn more. And they're still doing intake even during COVID. It's just the timelines are a little bit fuzzy right now, but it's definitely something to look at. I think as a global entrepreneur myself, you take advantage of everything around you, and it's not just what's in your own country, but if there's a really cool program in Europe or in Canada, like just take advantage of everything. Startup Chile for a long time was a great place to get your ideas started, and they were investing heavily. So really thinking about your company as a global company from day one is setting yourself up for success, because in order to scale, all of our markets are too small to scale to the heights of like a Shopify.
yeah,
So it's very important to diversify. So I would say that, as well as what's coming up. And by the time we get through COVID, hopefully, there'll be this whole network of Canadian trade accelerators. And that'll be a great way to stay close to home, working and leveraging the whole Canadian ecosystem. Because oftentimes as entrepreneurs, we're starting off young, but we do get older and we might have families, and it's harder to uproot our families and move across the world. And so the Canadian and trade accelerators are a great way for you to stay closer to home while leveraging the whole Canadian ecosystem. But I strongly encourage every entrepreneur listening today to really think about the global opportunities and think about not just the markets, but because Canada is a very small market, but the government resources that will invest in your innovation. And I think that's really an important thing that Canada can add to your company, is really helping with your R&D and your growth and your innovation and augmenting your AI talent. And I think, that could be part of your growth stack as you build domestically.
Yeah, I think those are some fantastic opportunities. So, with after covering all these opportunities for startups, I'd love to dig deep on your experiences as a community builder, right? So, you obviously started this organization which has created a lot of impact for Canada as a country. And myself as a community builder, I try to push this national agenda forward. You mentioned the Slack group you have there, so I created this WhatsApp group around, I think, 1 year ago, where we have this like Pakistan community builders WhatsApp group, right? So there are like 80 people, and I think collectively we represent all of Pakistan when it comes to technology or startups or innovation, right? So what are some of the challenges you faced, and what are some of the maybe lesson learned or maybe some stories from how you really established startup Canada?
Okay. Well, we definitely took the Brad Feld model of startup communities. Brad Feld is an investor out of Silicon Valley. Techstars actually is based in Boulder, Colorado. And there's, as you know, I mean, I'm speaking to the choir here, but as you know, community building requires ongoing events that constantly create opportunities for collision. So the first thing you do is just start like getting people connected and collaborating and serendipitously meeting. Bringing it's inclusive. Anyone who wants to join can. So it was really hard initially with a very tight-knit tech community to get them to think bigger and say, actually, no, everybody's welcome. Everybody of every ability, every background, arts background, social science background, everyone's welcome to the party. So making it as inclusive as possible was definitely a challenge, and it's changing over time for sure. Getting more women involved. When I started Startup Canada, all of our events were just men, and very much engineering and development. It was great. But to kind of create that more inclusive mindset definitely took some time. It also has to have a long-term vision. And this is where I think startup communities really trip up. So when we started Startup Canada, it was with a 25-year vision. So that means no matter if we stumbled or failed in between, we were focused on that 25-year vision, but that had to be part of my narrative at every opportunity. Oh, we just messed up there, but this is a 25-year vision, so it was okay to fail. It was okay to really try new things. But oftentimes egos definitely get in the way, particularly when you're trying to create a national movement. And just getting people thinking with that long-term vision totally changes the conversation. Because people know that they're not going to be in their particular role for 25 years. And so succession then needs to be a really key part of that whole experience. And so, as I mentioned earlier, succession is definitely the hardest part of community building, because community building is based on relationships of trust. And so you've cultivated all this trust, goodwill, and social capital. And then how do you then hand that over in a seamless way so that the momentum can continue and the energy can continue? But definitely one of the biggest challenges that we faced, of course, is a grassroots movement. And this is heard across the world with startup communities, just things around sustainability. So how do you make your startup community sustainable? How do you fund it? And all of those types of things. How do you govern it? What does governance look like in a way that is grassroots and creates momentum? For Canada, like Startup Canada has 250,000 entrepreneurs that is part of that network. So that's big for Canada, like quite big. That's more than a critical mass of the ecosystem. And so how do you do that? But the way that I lead is I always lead from behind. And the way that I also lead is I always lead to serve. So it's all about service before self and making a better world. and connecting the dots and almost never saying no. And just being that enabler in the ecosystem. But it is very hard. And the hardest part is definitely when egos get in the way. And so if you can strip down the egos and think about what we're actually trying to achieve for the future of our country and our world, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of take the self out of the work and do the good work that's needed in order to create the economy of the future.
Absolutely. I think some of those points I definitely resonate with myself. And, we face some of these challenges while in the beginning, we were pushing this national agenda that, our competition is not, for example, with this incubator and that incubator. It's with the whole world, right? This is a global economy, especially when we talk about startups, right? So we collectively need to come together, put our resources together, and take the country forward, right? And I think I definitely want to talk more about the point you highlighted about succession, right? So a lot of the times the new community builders, so I'd say that I'm fairly new. I only have spent 3.5 years. Maybe there are people who have spent, I don't know, 10, 15 years in the game, right? And some of my newer counterparts would often say that, there are these opportunities which are probably, people are holding on to this, right? So maybe I'm holding on to startup grind, right? But I've brought in like 13 new chapters, directors, and always trying to enable new people, right? So how do you let go, and how do you figure out that, when is the time to let go? When should you, just take a back seat and let other people lead?
I think, like entrepreneurs, community builders, we benefit from mentors around us. And often those mentors will signal you it's time to go. Are you still having fun? Are you still loving this? For me, I stayed as long as I stayed because I was committed to finding a successor to my organization. We scaled, so our model is very similar. So we have a national organization and we have chapters across the country called startup communities. And at a peak, we had 50 startup communities covering about 100 cities, towns, and villages, supported by about 300 volunteers across the country. And so during all of this, succession was very, very challenging. You have the relationships with the ministers and the prime minister, and you have to steward away, from where you can add the most value when it becomes so big. And so for me, finding the successor was really difficult, especially in the nonprofit sector, where, it might be much more appealing to work for the government, so it was hard. It was really hard to find a successor because community building is definitely not a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah.
It's 24/7. It's how you live and breathe. It's the culture. It's just like how you are, right? So finding that right fit. So of course you start from the inside, trying to recruit from inside the organization, and that's the ideal situation. But when that can't happen, then just asking the mentors and advisors around you, and going through a rigorous process through governance. But it's very hard. I have seen startup communities fail because they didn't have a succession plan from day one. Some of the most robust organizations in the world, like Amnesty International, let's talk about the Red Cross, because it's a very similar model the Rotary Club, right? You almost have like a year where your successor works alongside you and then they take over. And that's very similar to what I ended up doing. Whereas for my community building in the UK, I was repatriated back to Canada. I had to go. And so we recruited from inside. That was our only choice. We had to make it happen quickly. Whereas with Startup Canada, I was able to take the time that I needed. And it wasn't easy because it's kind of your baby, just like a startup, right? And it wasn't without its difficult times. But that's why it was said it was so difficult. So I really encourage every community builder to think about succession before you start. And it's not that you don't matter. Some of the best community builders I've seen, so Sergio Escobar is incredible in the Montreal startup ecosystem. He started up all the founder institutes, the startup weekends, and then he moved very quickly out into succession. And now he has a whole venture capital firm that is supporting so many startups with significant capital. So you never know as a community builder how your skills can then be used as you move away. It's like, yeah, I've got that, and move away. So continue to invest in your own growth. Or if this is really your life's work and you want to stay as a community builder, then stay, but at the same time, realize that it will be very irresponsible to stay if you don't. Let's say something happens, what's going to happen to your organization? It's the same dilemma every entrepreneur faces if they're looking for succession.
No, those are some amazing points. I think one of the things that I've observed, that a lot of times in community buildings, a lot of things revolve around the community builder's personality, right? So it's your personal relationships, it's a lot of friendships and stuff. So it's very hard to detach yourself and the organization that you're building, right? And over the years, this is one of the challenges that I faced, and now we do a lot of organization. We try to put the organization first, as compared to the individuals, right? But because succession is obviously something that is going to happen sooner than later, and I think at one point, I may stop being useful to this organization, and I may be ready for something else, right? You mentioned Sergio. So there's always something else you can do. You always need to grow yourself as a person as well, right? One of the other things that I've loved to learn from your journey is, how did you make Startup Canada sustainable? And what are some of the programs, maybe some of the ways that you generate revenue as an organization and stay sustainable? Because as I understand, non-profits are also just like any other business, except you don't take out profits, right? It is for a cause.
Yeah, you bet. Well, because so much of the government, all of our ecosystem essentially is funded by the government. What we were missing when I started Startup Canada was that grassroots culture with the right values in order to scale up companies. And so while in the UK, my organization was fully funded by the British government, in Canada, we started at grassroots, and we said for the first 5 years, no government funding. So no. So we would not take government funding. Because we needed to prove and create a grassroots ecosystem. Because sometimes if the government hands out a check too easily, then you're not incentivized, you're not hungry, to make that urgent change that's needed. You don't feel the pain, and so you need to feel the pain.
Yeah.
So what we did initially is, like any entrepreneur, I funded the initial few years of Startup Canada myself through savings. So it's like, just friends, family, and fools. You just like any entrepreneur. But what we started doing immediately was growing our digital presence. And so we're the largest digitally followed organization in Canada for entrepreneurship. And on every channel, we implemented a program. So twice a week, there's startup chats on Twitter. We had webinars and podcasts. We have 2 podcasts. Basically, we're a digital network for entrepreneurs at the top. And that was great to profile entrepreneurs, share our messages, build a critical mass of followers. But that also became an important revenue stream to sustain our organization through private sector funders who were looking to target the very entrepreneurs that we were looking to support. Then layer on top of that events, so every startup community and startup nation needs continual events that constantly engage the ecosystem. And so every year we would do national tours across the country, awards programs to recognize outstanding achievement in Canadian entrepreneurship. And also recognize the community builders as well, who are the unsung heroes that are really doing amazing work to support that entrepreneurial economy. And so we would run awards and tours across Canada, and every single year a big convention in our nation's capital with government called Startup Canada Day on the Hill. And that would bring thousands of entrepreneurs, all the ministers, government leaders, mash them together and do policy hackathons and policy hearings on everything, where entrepreneurs were essentially solving public policy problems for the government of Canada. And that was broadcast live through like our mainstream media channels. It was just wonderful. And so that regular cadence became how we funded the organization, through digital events, essentially a digital media network. as well as those events. At year 5, we were totally taken seriously as Canada's entrepreneurship organization. I will say each of our chapters across Canada did pay membership dues, but that was
Cool.
really for us to bring them to the capital and get them involved with our conventions and everything. So almost like a licensing agreement, but it was very marginal, just so that they had skin in the game, which is so important to motivate people. Everyone needs to have skin in the game and have a leadership and ownership mentality. But then once we hit year 5, then we really started to play as a heavy hitter and became a program delivery partner for the Government of Canada in service of entrepreneurs. So really reinforcing our work as Canada's entrepreneurship organization. And so, yeah, it's those types of things. So it took time, but I think, the organization is in year 7.5 of a 25-year vision. So I think we're doing very good. And our whole goal is that everybody in Canada, every Canadian knows that entrepreneurship is a viable career option and has a wing person beside them to help them to start up their ideas if they want it, and can immediate plug into the ecosystem, not just in Canada, but globally. And that's why it's so important that I'm here with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people are learning why community builders do what they do, and I'd love to, as one of the last questions of our discussion, learn from what kind of motivated you to go down this path of community building. And before I ask you, I'll tell that So I personally started because I realized that startup grind. Islamabad was not an active chapter. I thought I know a bunch of people that I can invite and interview. This doesn't seem like a hard job. Why not just start it? This was like 3.5 years ago, and the rest is history, right? So that created a lot of momentum. Those monthly events. Then we created like this digital accelerator, realizing that I've been through a couple incubators. There seems to be a lot missing when it comes to growth stage companies, right? Especially international expansion, going outside Pakistan. Specifically when most of your highly successful startups end up moving outside the country, or are led by founders based in Silicon Valley or other ecosystems, but have teams in Pakistan. So it's a very unique kind of ecosystem where there's this whole industry locally that is maybe reliant somewhat on companies that are being built in Silicon Valley and other ecosystems, right? So over the years we've played a very important role in connecting both these ecosystems on a massive scale, right? And my primary motivation, I would say, is that I really enjoy doing this, and most of these people happen to be my friends. So it's like I'm helping my friends and their friends, and it's just fun to do, right? So I'd love to learn from you what motivated you, and what kind of motivates you to keep doing this struggle and journey.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. Yeah, it's really interesting when you stumble upon something, and it was very
Yeah.
similar for me. Rather than working with my friends, because in all of these cases, when I started up, I actually didn't know anybody. So when I started up in the UK, like I had just finished my master's and I didn't know anybody in the UK. So really forming those relationships from scratch. And then in Canada, I came back to Canada, but before, when I was in Canada, I wasn't part of the entrepreneur ecosystem. So coming back and starting from scratch. So, but the way I stumbled upon and why I'm doing it is really for an individual, so changing an individual's life. So I was inspired by a keynote speaker for Oxford Entrepreneurs. His name was Levi Roots, and he was this big reggae man, and he was telling us his story about starting this salsa company, like salsa that you dip in chips
Yeah.
and eat. Anyways, so like he was telling us his story, and this was his grandmother's recipe from Jamaica, and he had been on the Dragon's Den in the UK, and he was giving back to his home country. He was so successful. And I realized then, because entrepreneurship, when you talk about tech companies, it can seem very daunting. When I saw this guy with this sauce making incredible impact on the world, that changed everything. And that's what motivated me to do what I do every day. And that's to help people to take what's unique about themselves, whether it's through a tech solution or otherwise, but everything's digitally enabled anyways. and to manifest that in the world in a way that will create opportunities for themselves, their families, their country, and humanity. And so I feel as though I have a unique skill set through political science, governance, and public policy and diplomacy to be able to make that connection and create that ecosystem, that systemic change that's needed to help individuals. And that's why a big part of my work is on inclusivity. So, how do we make sure everyone feels included in this digital economy and in this entrepreneurial economy? But I'm totally driven by individual transformations. And when the light bulb goes off, it's like, I can do it,
Yeah.
Reinforcing the values that it's okay to fail. You are going to fail. Just plan to fail. You are going to fail, but then it's the stumbling and it's the personal characteristics. I think one of the things that in juxtaposing my experience starting up in the UK and Canada, definitely the Canadian ecosystem is more tempered. So it's less risk adverse, it's more intentional, but it's a little slower. But what I love about the Startup Visa program is that when you become part of the Startup Visa program in Canada, Canada becomes very intentional about your company. So it's a very serious transaction. Whereas in the UK, things were fast and moving, and funds were flowing a little faster and haphazardly. So it's just a different way of doing business. But for me, I'm 100% motivated by the individual entrepreneur transformation and how policies and systems can change to help to enable that. So that's my story. But again, I stumbled upon it just like you.
No, that's an amazing story. I think this culture of stumbling upon things, this really tells people that not all things in life have to be planned. You just need to keep an open mind and explore life, and maybe you'll find your purpose while looking at a website or going to an event or just listening to someone, right? So it's really important to be open to the world, right, and to learn and explore everything. We've spent around 40 minutes talking, and I'd like to wrap up this discussion. But my last question to you would be that you've done a lot of work with the government in Canada, right? In a country like Pakistan, policy plays a very key role in all things, and especially when it comes to entrepreneurship and startups. And at times you find it challenging to kind of lobby the government and all the decision makers who may not be very tech savvy.
Yeah.
So how did you solve these challenges? How does one bring the government and all these stakeholders on board to your vision?
Well, what's very important is having kind of a local impact. So through all of your startup grind chapters across the country, you have real entrepreneurs who are constituents of local representatives of the government. And so it's very important to come at it top down and bottom up, and squash it in the middle, and own it.
Makes sense.
So our local chapter leaders would meet with the members of parliament in their own constituencies, in their hometowns, have entrepreneur roundtables, and it's really having a friendly tone. I think things have changed from maybe previous generations where lobbying was like hitting hard, and it's all about like community building friendships, right?
Yeah.
So it's these are some of the challenges we're facing. How can I can actually hire 20 more people in our community, 200 more people. I can open this great facility. So it's very local, economic driven. But then the macro policies should come from headquarters. So that would be you. It's very important to be very clear. I think a lot of time the recommendations that these guys are getting are very general. Our startups need more funding. Okay, what does that mean? What's the concrete policy? Other tools that I've used is op-eds in the national media. So thought leadership columns, growing my social media community, so that, wow, like this is a big audience. This is a very important group that we need to be in front of. Creating platforms for them. In the UK, I started outside of government. I started an all-party parliamentary group for entrepreneurship education. And so that's when you invite all the different parties just champions, and they can be backbenchers, or they don't necessarily need to be the ministers, but just starting to get your footprint in Canada. Startup Canada is based in our nation's capital, and we are literally across the street from the Prime Minister's office and 1 block away from Parliament Hill. So we
Wow.
actually created our organization to be an event hub for government and entrepreneurs to come together. But it does take time. But as you know, the biggest way to reinforce relationships is through institutionalizing those relationships. And you can do that through regular events with them. You can do that with regular reports, regular meetings. I've started the Startup Canada Task Force, where I brought all the national leaders of the accelerators, incubators, research parks, and everything to the small business minister. Like, you just, if you're the place they can go to figure out what's happening in the ecosystem, if you're the place that they can go for all of the data, and you're just there and you're friendly, a friendly voice, you can get a lot done. Another way to do it is to recruit someone from within a minister's office or from government who shares your vision and your digital acumen and your digital literacy, and who can be your champion on the inside in many departments. So it really requires a whole government strategy that can lead to big impact for the country. In Europe, there's something called Ally for Startups. And it's all of the different national organizations for entrepreneurship that collaborate on 13 key things startups need to scale. So I'm happy to circulate that report to you, but I thought that was a great initiative that was super concrete. There's also something called the Startup Nations Network that shares policies. So if you can be that conduit and that voice in the country, then you've got this. And the country needs it. They need to hear the voice of startups, but really thinking about them as an end user that have a very different economy around them, a very different language, and working within their structures to make a difference. So hopefully that helps a bit.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It helps a lot. And just to add, the summit we did last month, it was inaugurated by the Information Minister of Pakistan, and then virtually, and then a bunch of other government officials participated virtually, which was very new for them as well. And part of the reason why we try to do a lot of things in Islamabad, like you said, is to just engage with these people, right, in a friendly manner, just events and dinners and different interactions. The first step, I think, is to kind of raise awareness on the impact of your work, right? So there are people who are building startups, who are working as remote engineers, who are creating a lot of impact for the local economy. But maybe these decision makers are not even aware of all this impact, right? So just to kind of introduce these people, have these conversations in connection, and then you find champions among them who understand your cause and understand their positioning with this cause, right? Which now is more evident with COVID, that technology is the future. When a lot of traditional businesses are hit hard, a lot of tech businesses are not impacted, and a lot of tech jobs, especially in Pakistan, where a lot of outsourcing happens, they're not as much impacted as other businesses, right? So with this, I'll just ask my last question, and this is the final last. You've worked with all these different decision makers, all these amazing startups and community builders from across the country, and interacted with all of them globally. What is like your one advice that you would give to entrepreneurs who are starting up?
Okay. Oh, my biggest piece of advice is to leverage the ecosystem. It's a very lonely journey to be an entrepreneur, and you will fail. I'm so sorry. But keep going, and you will need to pivot many times. But it really helps when you have the support of your ecosystem. So tap into every program you can find in the country, outside of the country, in your local community. Leverage every mentor you can. Get champions. Be nice, be kind, be cool. Be fun to work with. It's really important as an entrepreneur that you get along with the rest of the ecosystem. And essentially become their poster child. Be the poster child of your ecosystem, because your success, they're going to want to stamp. And so they want you to succeed. So that's my biggest piece of advice for every entrepreneur, is to leverage the ecosystem around you and be cool, because it's more fun to be working alongside cool people who are kind than, others. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's some fantastic advice, especially when there are just so many organizations working in Pakistan to support entrepreneurs and even global organizations, right? So we just launched this program with AWS and previously, Techstars and all these different players. I think this is like an amazing time to start a startup. Well, with this, I'd like to thank you, Victoria, for your time and taking out, sharing your story and sharing your thoughts and sharing all the journey that you went through. I think that will inspire a lot of people, not just I'm totally inspired, but I hope a lot more entrepreneurs and ecosystem builders are inspired by the work that you have done. Again, thank you so much for taking out the time and joining us. Hopefully we'll host you in Pakistan in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, and hopefully I'll see you at the conference next year.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having
Goodbye.
me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. It was an honor. Bye.